Well, my name's Dusty. Dusty Decker. I am the youth ministries pastor here at Brian. Like you said, I've been here almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years the beginning of January. And but I've been in youth ministry now for full-time for 21 years and have been in youth ministry working either as an intern or an assistant now for, probably almost 30 years. And so yes, I started when I was 10. No, I'm just joking. But I've been doing this for a long time, and I have a wife and 3 daughters. My 3 daughters are why I don't have any hair. I have 2 that are in high school, a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, and then one in college that is 20 that just got engaged about 2 weeks ago. So it was great. I have a lot to go over, but I got to tell you the story of how he asked me if he could marry her. We were out playing golf, and he looked real nervous. And we're out there playing, and he's like, for the first 3 or 4 holes, every time I took a shot, he was like, "That was a great shot." And I'm like, "What is wrong with you? Like, what is? Oh, that was a good shot." And I'd just gone in the woods or something, right? And then we get on like the 5th hole, and after we tee off and we get up to the fairway, we're walking up the fairway, and he's like, "So I have to ask you a question. So Emma and I have really been getting to know each other real well, and I want to know if you can, if I could ask her to marry me." And I had to make him sweat, so I said, "Hold on, let me take this shot, and I'll tell you." And and then we talked about it. I gave him a couple conditions about keeping Christ first in the family and loving my daughter unconditionally, and he was like, "Oh yes, sir." He'd never called me sir in his life, so I gave him a hug, and so then we get to the next hole. I'm like, "So how nervous are you?" And he's like, "I don't think I can play anymore." And I was like, "All right, let's go get ice cream." So. But I love being a dad. I love being a husband. But I also love being a youth pastor. When I say the word teenager, what comes to mind? Just shout a word. What comes to mind when you hear teenager? What? What did I hear? Okay. What else? What? Insane. All right. What else? Impulsive. All right. Drama. What was it? Huh? Know-it-all? Okay. Rebellion. Okay. I'm glad you guys have positive things to say about teens this morning. This is awesome. I love it. No. What was yours? Rolling of the eyes. Another positive. All right. Well, honestly, when we look at teens, we can get all different kinds of reactions. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about who teens are and really what youth ministry has come through, and give you a little history lesson on that. But to start out, I just have to tell you about this story. I've gone on numerous mission trips throughout my life and taken teens all over the world. And I remember we were getting ready to take our teens one summer to Panama. And we were going to go work in the rainforest in a village. And so we decided to go down early and scout this area with this missionary. This missionary's name is Vince. And he's got super big muscles, bald head, goatee. In Panama, he looks like a drug lord, but he's not. He's a missionary. And we get down there, and I meet this guy, and he's like, "All right, so we're going to go out to the village, and to do that, we're going to take a boat out of the Panama Canal, go out in the ocean about 2.5 hours, take a left, go inland, and start going up a river another 2 hours until we get to this village in the middle of the forest." I'm like, "All right, that sounds cool. I'm real adventurous." So we get there, and it takes us about 5 hours by boat to get there. And we finally get there, and it's just getting dark. And we get to the house that we're staying at, and the guy that lives in the village, that's kind of his right-hand man, his name is Chino, and he's there to help us. And he said, "Dusty, you seem pretty adventurous. You came out here like this. what do you say we go crocodile hunting? And I was like, okay, that sounds like fun. And he's like, all right, well, we'll wait till midnight because that's the best time. And I'm like, what? And okay, I'll roll with it. So it comes around, and I'm trying to stay up, and these guys, we're talking about Panama and all the different stuff that can kill you there. And he goes, okay, I think it's dark enough. It's about 11:40. I think it's dark enough. Let's get ready to go. And I said, okay, well, which gun do I get to use? And he said, oh, no, we don't use guns. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, well, Chino, go get them. And Chino runs outside, and then we head outside to get in the truck to head down there. And he comes back out with these big pieces, about 4 or 5 foot pieces of rebar that are sharpened on one end. And he said, we spear them. I said, okay, that sounds interesting. So we take the truck and we drive through the village and we go all through the jungle and get down to this river. And I was like, well, which boat are we taking? Because there are 2 or 3 docked right there on the river. And he said, oh, we don't take a boat. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, no, we wade in the river. I said, okay, that's another thing I wasn't expecting. All right, well, and he said, here's a headlamp. Put that on your head and turn it on. And then when we go out in the river, I want you to look because you're going to see tons of eyeballs looking at you. I was like, that's creepy. And he said, if you see white eyeballs, those are usually always frogs. But if you see a red pair of eyeballs, that is a croc. And I said, well, how big do these crocs get? And he said, well, the neighbor, to Chino up there, he last week he got a 14-footer. And I said, okay, and we are going to be in the water with these guys, right? And so we start out, and we turn on the headlamps, and we start walking out. And he said, stay 10 feet behind me. Take the exact steps I take. Never deviate from them. Like I'm going to start running up the river looking for crocs by myself. And I said, okay. So we get out there, and we start going. And it starts about ankle deep. And then we go a little bit further, and it starts getting up to about our knees. And then we start going a little further, and now it's up to about mid-thigh. And then we go a little further, and I hear him say, oh, stop. Of course, I'm stopping. He said, look over there. And I turn around, and I see 2 red eyes looking right at us over by the bank. He goes, it looks like about a 6 or 7 footer. And I was like, okay, that makes me feel even more comfortable. He said, stay close to me. We're going to get over next to it. He goes, here, hold my rebar. I'm going to jump on his back and grab my Bowie knife, and I am just going to stab him in the head. And I said, I am out here with a crazy man, right? Like, what, are you serious? So we start getting closer and closer, and he goes, okay, I forgot to tell you. If one of them gets me and pulls me under, help pull me up so I don't drown. And if one of them gets you and pulls you under, I'll do the same for you. Are you kidding me? What is going? I said, okay. He's like, stay close to me. Here we go. We start walking up to this thing. He gets right up to this thing, and I could see the whole thing right on the bank. He gets right up to this croc, and at this point, I realized that right where we are in this thing, it is the smelliest, grossest smell. And later I found out that where the crocs are, it's usually the smelliest. And I'm like, okay, I'm in the middle of about waist-high water. It smells rancid. I'm behind a crazy man, and I'm about to die. Jesus, why did I go into ministry, right? He gets right up to the croc, and as soon as he gets ready to jump on it, it scares, it spooks, and boom, right into the water. And he turns around and he goes, we have a swimmer. And I was like, yeah, you have a pier right here too, right? Like I glad we're in the river, right? And so he goes, let's wait and see if it pops back up. And sure enough, it pops up down the river. And we start walking towards it again, about 30 yards up the river. And now the water's getting up almost to our armpits. And at this time, he turns around to me and he says, I don't think this is so safe. I think we should probably get out now. Can I just tell you, it doesn't take a crazy, jacked up dude in the middle of the rainforest, in the middle of a croc-infested river, to tell me it's not safe to get me out of that river. Man, I beelined it straight to the shore, and he laughed at that so bad, like, I can't believe you're so scared. And I was like, yeah, well, he told me later that if it's anywhere above your knees, they have the advantage because they can kill you. And I said, well, I know I want to see Jesus, but not this quick, right? When I think of working with teens, right, and we talk about teens, I named today Teens or Crocs, making sense of adolescence. Because honestly, I feel like this is how parents and people feel about teens. Notice we didn't get a whole lot of positive answers just a little bit ago. And I feel like this is kind of the way people think of it, especially parents. They're kind of scared. They don't really want to face it. They're not really prepared. They don't have the right tools. You can't really see what's coming around the corner. When they finally get there, they're surprised by the reality of what teens are like. And, of course, finally, once they get into the teens' environment, their room, it smells really bad, right? But we can learn a lot about parenting or helping or ministering to teens if we know what we're looking at. So today I want to talk a little bit about what adolescence is, what teens are, why they act a little bit they do, and then talk to you about why we do youth ministry the way we do. Because in this series, we're talking about people that are in different things that we don't know about. And I want to kind of tell you what we do. And so the word adolescence actually came around in the early 1900s by a guy named G. Stanley Hall, who wrote a book. He was a professor in Massachusetts, and he wrote this book, and he talked about adolescence. And back then, adolescence to him was between the ages of 14 and a half to 16 years old. That's when you were adolescent back then. It was about an 18-month period, and it starts at puberty and ends when you go to work, when you're self-dependent. And back then, when you're 16, you're done with school, you're working on the farm, right? And then we get to the 1960s and 70s, and now the age of adolescence has now gone from around 13 years, which is around the onset of puberty, to about 18 years old, because college is not as common. It's starting to get there, but usually you get married young, you start working, and 18 you're dependent. Fast forward to today. Adolescence, by most authorities, will say that today puberty starts around 10 and a half to 11 years old, and that adolescence can go all the way up to mid to late 20s. And you say, whoa, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't they be working? Think about it. Now, not only is college a normalcy, but now grad school's even starting to become that. And students or teens or those in their early 20s, mid-20s, don't become self-sufficient until then. Whether we like that or not, that's the reality. So we got to think, okay, how do we minister to them? Well, there's three tasks, and actually back in 1908, old G. Stanley Hall wrote this in his book, and it is so poignant to our students today. There are three different tasks that speak to teenagers, and those three things, if this will work, I don't think it's working. If you just want to advance the slides for me, that'd be fine. The three are this: identity, autonomy, and affinity. Identity, autonomy, and affinity. And let me tell you what those mean. So identity is, who am I? Self-perception. We know that students, when they get to puberty, they're trying to figure out who they are and what they're like. a child, if you look at brain development, children before puberty think in a binary, a black and white way of thinking because their brain hasn't developed. That's why kids that are younger love your dad jokes, but when they become teens, they don't, right? Because when they're younger, the black and white is funny, right? And you can tell them, do this, don't do this. But once they hit puberty and become an adolescent, now they're starting to think abstractly, right? It's no longer this or that. Now they're like, okay, I need to think of not only what's right or wrong, but why it's right or wrong, right? And so what a lot of parents see as rebellion is actually students just trying to figure out why and figuring out what they believe and why they believe it. And so identity comes from students trying to figure out, okay, I need to figure out who I am now. I'm changing physically, I'm changing mentally, emotionally. And then the next one is autonomy, which means how am I unique and different from everybody else? It's really independence. Another form of what we would think is rebellion is actually a child defining themselves in relation to others, primarily the family. How am I different from my mom and dad? It's no longer cool to be around mom and dad. I remember when I became a middle schooler, I made my dad drop me off 3 blocks from the school because I didn't want them to see his old truck that he was dropping me off in because I thought it would embarrass me, right? That was me saying that I need autonomy, right? I didn't know what I was doing, as a middle schooler. I don't know that, but that's what's happening, individualism. And then the last one is affinity. Where do I belong? My likeness, my attraction. Students desire to belong. Students desire to be liked. And it's more than just the popular kids or not popular kids. Today it's the gamers, the video gamers. It's the athletes. It's the band kids, whatever it is. And there's different forms of relationships. And so when we look at this with youth ministry, I want us to take a little trip down memory lane about youth ministry and think to yourself, how many of you have been attending church for a long time, like maybe since you were a kid? Okay, a lot of you. So you are going to remember some of these phases that I'm going to talk about. The first one is back in the 50s and 60s. It was the beginning of youth ministry. There had never been this thing called youth ministry before. And back in the 50s and 60s, all of a sudden, they started these things that were kind of like rallies. And what they did was they targeted identity. Okay? They targeted identity. And what they did was it was very proclamation driven. And think back, if you can, some of you, and think back, and you think of things like Youth for Christ, where Billy Graham would come and do a youth conference, a youth rally, and they would have these tents, and they would tell all the youth to come. And back then, these high schoolers would come, and they would come dressed in suits, dressed in their Sunday best. They would come and sit down. They would sing the exact same hymns that they sing in church. The preacher would give the same fire and brimstone message that they would hear in church. Everything's exactly like big church, like adult church, but it's with students. Why do you think that became so popular? Because they wanted their own identity. They no longer wanted to be like, they no longer wanted to say, we're just a church. Now they're like, we want to have our own identity. And the main thing that this helped with teens was that it gave them a place to be taught who they were, right? Rallies were the same as adults, just for teens. And he had all these different ministries that came out of that time period. You had Youth for Christ or Young Life or some of these other parachurch organizations that came out. And then you get to the 70s through the 90s, and this is what I don't know if anybody else calls it this, but this is the glory days of youth ministry, the 70s to the 90s. And really what happened was they targeted autonomy. And what I mean by that is youth ministry was really program driven. And if you remember back anywhere from the 70s to the 90s, maybe you were in a youth group back then. But what happened was they would do the craziest things, and they would try and be as different from main service as they could. They would have pies in the face, and they would have people come out in craziness. And it was just anything that could be completely different than the main service. It was kind of the creation of the, quote, youth group, right? With wacky games and wild youth rooms and pizza parties and everything different, that we can be different than adults, right? The main thing that this helped with teens was this was giving them kind of this feeling like they were set apart from society, set apart from the norm. And that drew students in to teach them about Jesus. And it was awesome, and kids got saved. But eventually what happened was the students didn't want autonomy anymore. They didn't want the craziness. What happened was students started to change, and now they started wanting affinity. And that brings us kind of to the 2000s. In youth ministry in the 2000s, I started in 99, so I saw this change. I started with the crazy games and the craziness, and then realized, you know what, we need to change some things, because students don't just need identity and autonomy. They also need affinity. They need to get with other students that are like them. And so you start seeing small groups form, right? Kind of like in the main church, in church as a whole, small groups start to form. Why? Because affinity is something that we need. Getting with other people that we're like. And studies show that children and teens influence over 50% of all household purchases. And what I mean by that is where autonomy was needed by so many of the adolescents, teen culture quickly became popular culture during this time. It was no longer you had music that adults listened to and music that teens listened to. Now adults are starting to listen to teen music. And now adults are starting to watch commercials that are all geared straight to teens. And if you look even today, most commercials are going to be geared towards that younger person, that adolescent. Why? Because they know that the adolescents are now setting the tone for society, whether we like it or not, right? And so what happens is affinities started rising as the need within teens, and teenagers started saying, you know what? I'm starting to get involved with a lot of things, and there's a lot of people that I like, and I want to start doing life with them. And if youth ministry didn't start doing that, they were going to lose them. And so what happened is we got the rise of affinity groups. Think about teens that are either yours or neighbors or even grandkids. Think about all the affinity groups they're in. They're on a soccer team, and they have friends there. They're in band. They have friends there. They're in drama club. They have friends there. They have friends in their math class that they get together and do things together. They might be in dance classes, and they have friends there. They come to youth group, and they have their set of friends there. And then, of course, the ultimate affinity group, they have their family. And what happens is these students start having all these different affinity groups, different friend groups. And what happens, what we've seen now, is that while that attracted students to hear the Word of God, we're now moving into a new culture. And this is probably the one that I believe is the most important for teens. The culture that we're in now. It probably, I would say, started around 2015-ish. And that's our current youth ministry. And that is this, that We have so many students that have been in these affinity groups, and they're building relationships, but there's no depth. They have friends they say hi to and hang out here, no depth. Friends they have here, no depth. Friends they have here, and then we wonder as parents, why won't you talk to me about things? Why won't you tell me your feelings? Why won't this happen? Because they're not used to being deep with anybody. Around 2015, culture started really pushing the idea that we can't push against what others believe or say, right? Like, if you believe something different than me, I can't have a normal conversation with you. We have to hate each other, right? That this non-offending had been around for a long time, but now society was pushing actions to confirm individualism. What happens is that we have one person saying, I believe this. Let's see if this is on the screen. The little stick figures, that might help you. Can you bring that up? What happens is you have this one person that's saying, this is what I believe. And then all of a sudden another person comes up and says, okay, well, this is what I believe. And person A is saying to person B, that's fine. You believe what you believe, I'll believe what I believe, as long as we don't offend each other, right? And so then what happens? Another person joins, and another person joins, and another person joins, and all of a sudden you have this culture of everybody having their own opinions, and it doesn't matter what you believe because what you believe's right for you and what I believe's right for me, right? And it creates this cloud in society. And what the unfortunate thing that happens is that it creates isolation. And we wonder why students are getting depressed and feeling alone. And we wonder why they feel lonely. Not just students, though. We as adults feel lonely sometimes. Why? Because we live in a culture that pushes isolation. That pushes the fact that we all have our own little belief system. There's no solid base for agreement. So a teen feels lonely and isolated. In an us versus them culture, true identity is being lost. And you might say, but they have so many affinity groups like sports and band and school. How can they feel lonely? I hear this from parents all the time. How come my student tells me they're lonely and they cry at night? Because they're part of all these different groups. Well, all those different groups and society is starting to push towards individualism. And what happens is we forget that there's not one thing, one truth that might be holding them together. When in reality, what we need to do in youth ministry today is this. We need to give them a solid foundation that they agree on, that they see as a truth, to then share their opinions from. It's bringing identity back to these kids that feel like they don't have an identity anymore because the society is just kind of wishy-washy, right? It's kind of like this. How many of you have ever heard of the Biodome? Do you remember when they built the Biodome? Anybody know where that was? Was that Arizona? What? Arizona. All right. And do you guys remember, was that a success or a failure? Yeah, it was a big failure, right? They put everybody in this biodome, and then, of course, I think there was a lot of fighting and craziness that went on, and it didn't work. And I think there was actually a outside ants or something were getting in. They didn't. I don't know. But in that biodome, they planted trees, and the trees that grew in the biodome, every time they would grow and start getting tall, they'd fall over. So they plant again, tree, fall over. You know why those trees fell over? Because there was no wind. There was nothing challenging them. There was nothing challenging them to grow roots in order to have a strong foundation. You see, students today need that. I believe the next wave of youth ministry is us taking students deep in the faith. Not just giving them a show, not just trying to be different, but taking them deep in the faith so that when they get to college and somebody says, okay, if God's such a loving God, how does he allow evil in the world? They'll be prepared. When they say, okay, if God's so big, can he make a rock so big that he can't move it? They'll be prepared. When they ask questions like that, they'll be prepared. And so we actually here in the youth ministry are trying to make this switch from just affinity groups to going deep with students so that they have roots. And so we're starting a new podcast, which for students is very popular right now. And we're going to be talking about these. And so we've asked students to give us questions. Last week I got my first question. It was from a middle schooler. And her question was this: as a 7th grade girl, her question was, if God is a loving God and he already knew that Adam and Eve were going to sin, why did he put the tree in the middle of the garden in the first place? Whoa. 7th grade girl. Anybody want to answer that for me? I mean, seriously. It's like students are desiring the deep things of faith. And so how do we do this? How do we give this to them? Well, I think we need to create what I call cognitive autonomy. This just means creating space to work things out and making room for children to reach positions that might not be the same as everybody else, but they realize why they believe it. You see, I think a lot of times we get in our minds as parents or as grandparents or as leaders or as teachers that adolescents are still in the binary kid phase. So when we say this is what's right and this is what's wrong and this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't, and then we get surprised why they don't understand it or they come back later. I have had some parents come to me and say, Dusty, my 9th grade son just came to us at dinner and told us he isn't sure whether he can believe the Bible. He's doubting whether the Bible is true. And the world is falling, right? That's what the parents say. And I usually look at them and I'm like, that's awesome. And they're like, what? You're the youth pastor. And I'm like, do you understand what's happening? He's figuring it out on his own. He's making his faith his own. That's how he's going to survive when he gets out of high school. And he's bringing it to you to help him figure it out. Do you know how big an honor that is? I kind of say it like this. We'll finish with this. A lot of people look at how we teach teens and we think, okay, this is the model that we should show them. We have the teen down here in the bottom and we want them to get there spiritually. And so we tell, okay, teens, it's a gradual climb. You're not going to get to the spiritual place you want to be. It's a gradual climb and you'll eventually get there. But that's not really how life works, is it? And so then we go to this model and we say, okay, well, and this is the model that most of us have been taught, that, you know what, your life as a Christian has peaks and valleys. And as you have these highs, you're going to have some lows, but you're constantly working towards Christ, right? But can I tell you, as an adolescent, as a teenager, as somebody that's trying to figure out everything in the world anew because they're getting this whole new thinking system, this doesn't really work for them because it's still a constant. When you think about how a student gets to spiritual growth, you have to do this. I call it you embrace the squiggle. Because this is a teen's life right here. And what's cool about it is this. that if you help them, it points to Christ. You see, a teen's not wanting somebody to say, you need to do this and not this. What they need is they need to have somebody come alongside them as they go throughout this squiggle that is urging them forward to get to Christ. Look at this painting. I saw this the other day and thought about the squiggle. It looks like something I could paint in my garage, but this painting was actually done by a guy named Cy Twombly, and this painting sold for over $34 million. Now, how many of you in your mind, when you saw this painting and just heard the price, was like, are you kidding me? That's not worth $34 million. Can I ask you this now? How many of us, when we think the word teenager or we see a teen, we think, yeah, trouble. Yeah, rebellion. Rolled eyes. Craziness. Or how many of us look at that squiggle, that teenager, and say priceless? Because once we do that, then we can reach teens for Christ. So here's what I want to ask you. I want you to ask this around your tables. Answer these two questions. What were you like as a teenager? And which of the three tasks did you seek the most? Because all teens seek all three, which is identity, autonomy. Identity, finding out who you are. Autonomy, being different. Or affinity, trying to be liked. Talk about what you were like as a teen and which one of those three you feel like you really went after as a teen. And then we'll end with a little Q&A. So go ahead and do that.